For centuries, society has grappled with a haunting question. Why do some human beings cross the unimaginable line from violence to repeated, calculated murder? Serial killers stand at the darkest edge of human behavior. They challenge our assumptions about morality, empathy, and the limits of the human mind. They force us to confront a reality that feels both distant and frighteningly close. In this extended documentary, we journey deep into the psychology of serial killers. We explore the science, the patterns, and the human experiences that shape these rare but devastating criminals. Not to sensationalize, but to understand, so that knowledge can become prevention. A serial killer is commonly described as someone who commits 3 or more murders, separated by cooling-off periods. This pattern differentiates them from mass murderers or spree killers, who strike in bursts of uncontrolled violence. Serial killers, however, return to their lives between crimes. They eat lunch. They clock in at work. They talk to friends and neighbors. The mask of normalcy is part of their method, and part of the mystery. Their crimes are rarely impulsive. Instead, they reflect planning, fantasy, and a psychological cycle that builds slowly over time. Understanding this cycle is key to understanding the mind behind it. The debate over nature versus nurture has persisted for decades. Are serial killers the product of their biology, their environment, or an unsettling combination of the two? Modern research suggests it is never one single cause. Instead, serial killers often emerge from a complex blend of risk factors. Some studies show that violent offenders may have reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain responsible for controlling impulses, regulating emotions, and making moral decisions. Others show abnormalities in the amygdala, a region tied to fear, empathy, and aggression. These neurological differences do not guarantee violent behavior. Most people with similar abnormalities never commit a crime. But under the wrong conditions, these traits can become part of a dangerous psychological foundation. The environment can add the final pieces. A significant number of serial killers report traumatic childhoods filled with instability, abuse, neglect, or emotional abandonment. Some grow up witnessing violence that becomes normalized. Others retreat into fantasy worlds to escape fear or loneliness. In childhood, these coping mechanisms may appear harmless, but in adults predisposed to violent behavior, they can fuel darker impulses. Serial killers are rarely the product of one moment or one event. They are shaped over years, sometimes decades. One of the most common psychological traits associated with serial killers is psychopathy. But psychopathy is widely misunderstood. Not all psychopaths are violent, and many violent offenders are not technically psychopaths. However, serial killers frequently display psychopathic traits that allow them to hide in plain sight. These include a lack of empathy, superficial charm, manipulative behavior, shallow emotions, a grandiose sense of self, and an uncanny ability to mimic feelings they do not actually experience. A psychopath can look directly into a grieving person's eyes and imitate sympathy without feeling any. They can study human behavior the way someone else studies a language, learning which expressions and reactions create trust. This ability to blend in is one of the reasons serial killers often go undetected for years. To them, people are not individuals with stories and families. They are tools, objects, means to an end. This emotional detachment is central to understanding their psychology. One of the most important psychological traits shared across many serial killers is the presence of violent fantasy. These fantasies often begin long before the first crime, sometimes in adolescence, sometimes even earlier. At first, they may be vague, a desire for control, power, dominance. Over time, they grow more detailed and more vivid. The killer imagines scenarios, victims, locations, and outcomes. These fantasies become rehearsals, a mental script that plays on repeat. And eventually, fantasy alone stops being enough. The urge to make the imaginary scenario real becomes overwhelming. For many serial killers, this moment marks the transition from fantasy to action, from thought to crime. Even after the murders begin, fantasy continues to drive their behavior. They replay the crime in their minds. They relive the details. They enhance their fantasies to prepare for the next event. Fantasy is not just a spark, it is the fuel. Serial killers rarely choose victims at random. Their choices often reveal hidden motives, emotional triggers, or symbolic meanings. Some select victims who represent someone from their past, a parent, a bully, a source of trauma. Others choose victims based on vulnerability or accessibility. Some prefer strangers to avoid emotional complication. Others choose victims from specific groups that match their internal fantasies. For many killers, the process of selecting a victim becomes part of the ritual. The hunt can provide power, adrenaline, and a sense of control that may surpass the crime itself. Victim selection is psychological, not spontaneous. It reveals patterns that can help investigators understand the killer's mind. The psychological cycle of a serial killer is consistent enough that many experts consider it a hallmark of the behavior. It begins with fantasy, vivid, consuming, and emotionally charged. Over time, the fantasy grows stronger than the killer's ability to resist it. Next comes planning. Some killers plan for weeks, others only for hours. But planning is almost always present. Then comes the act itself, the moment when the killer's fantasy becomes reality. After the crime, many experience a temporary sense of calm, a release, a feeling of control or satisfaction. This period of apparent normalcy is known as the cooling-off period. But the relief never lasts. The fantasy returns, the craving intensifies, and the cycle begins again. This repeated cycle is what defines a serial killer psychologically. It is also what makes them so dangerous. Serial killers often avoid detection, not because they are brilliant, but because they are ordinary. They can live quietly, blending into the background of everyday life. They may hold steady jobs, maintain relationships, or participate in social activities. Many appear calm, polite, or even charming. Their ability to mimic normal behavior is one of their strongest tools. Some follow news coverage of their own crimes. Some study police procedures. A few even change their methods based on what detectives reveal to the public. The anonymity of modern society, crowded cities, online interactions, transient lifestyles, further enables them to hide. Serial killers do not always stand out. Sometimes, that is exactly why they are so effective. Serial killers represent the far end of a spectrum of violent behavior. By studying them, psychologists gain insights into aggression, trauma, and emotional development. But there is another reason this research matters. Understanding the warning signs, chronic cruelty, escalating fantasies, lack of empathy, manipulative behavior, and obsessive violence can help identify risks long before they escalate. Knowledge does not excuse brutality, but knowledge can prevent future victims. Serial killers captivate our attention because they challenge what we believe about humanity. They show us what happens when empathy collapses, when fantasy replaces reality, and when trauma, biology, and psychology collide in the worst possible way. They are rare, but their impact is enormous. And by understanding their minds, we not only see the darkness more clearly, we also gain a deeper appreciation for the fragile balance that keeps most people far from that edge. Thank you for listening. If you want more deep dives into criminal psychology, specific serial killer profiles, or other true crime topics, let me know.